You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. People think anti-Semitism is terrible in today's day and age, but if you went back to the 1930s and 1940s, you'd be surprised how things were at that particular moment in history. There were more than 100 anti-Semitic groups operating openly in the United States. Few Americans dared to speak out or fight back. You had radio hosts that attacked Jews on a regular basis, and things got to be very, very bad until the Jewish mafia got involved fighting these Nazis and anti-Semites. Our guest is Michael Benson, the author of more than 60 books, and his latest book is called Gangsters versus Nazis, How the Jewish Mobsters Battled Nazis in Wartime America. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Zev.
Thank you. So it's really an untold story. So how did you stumble upon it?
Well, I had known parts of the story from previous research I've done.
I knew books about the mob.
I knew about Sparky Rubenstein from writing about JFK's assassination. I knew about Mickey Cohen and bumping heads in a jail cell out in the West Coast, and I knew I knew that Meyer Lansky had participated in the Yorkville casino riot. But until I found out about Judge Nathan Perlman, who is the straw that stirs this drink, and I found out that it was an organized effort with at least a partial pass from the judicial system, then I knew it was a story that really needed to be told.
So before we get to how the judge and how people wanted to stop the Nazis in America, let's talk about the landscape. What was it like? Let's talk about the anti-Semitism, the groups, the Bund. We're talking about New York City.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to imagine now, but in 1938,
Upper East Side of Manhattan.
Yeah. Most Americans were against going to war with Hitler. He marched across Europe. He was threatening Great Britain. But as our story takes place, the thing that's on America's mind is the Depression. It's almost a full decade old at that point. It's bleak. And under those circumstances, very easy for hate groups to put out there that there's a scapegoat. And Jews were taking the blame without any evidence. Jews have all the money, they're all communists, and that's why you're poor. So we should, cut this cancer out of society. And of course, in a much more horrible sense, it was going on in Europe as well. But in America, it was taking hold, and especially among German Americans who were more apt to be seduced by the patriotism involved in loving Hitler and all of his theories. It wasn't so much at the numbers of Nazi sympathizers, although there were about 100,000 estimated.
100,000
really
Nazi sympathizers.
The brazen nature. They really were smug about it. They didn't think there was going to be any blowback. They could say whatever they wanted to do about the Jews because the Jews were soft and they weren't going to fight back. Well, they made the mistake of having a demonstration in Lower Manhattan in the Bowling Green area outside the U.S. Customs building, while a patriotic ceremony was going on outside the same spot. And the Nazi sympathizers refused to back down and chanted their hateful slogans until the ceremony with the American ceremony was forced to move inside. And that's what ticked off Judge Nathan Perlman, who was a former U.S. congressman. He was a special sessions judge in New York City. He had voted to repeal prohibition and may have partaken in alcoholic beverages during prohibition, because when he got ticked off at the Nazis, first guy he called was an ex bootlegger and the number one all-time Jewish gangster, Meyer Lansky.
So what happened? So he calls a Jewish mafia guy, and what does he expect him to do? He doesn't expect him to act within the law, right?
No. Well, and that's the beauty of my book, is that the good guys are the only ones breaking the law. The bad guys, the Nazis, are blanketed by the First Amendment. There are no hate speech laws in America at the time. So as long as they don't say anything obscene or shout fire in a crowded room, they can say whatever they want. So what Judge Perlman decided was what these Nazis needed was a good punch in the nose. So he asks Lansky if he knows any boys that might want to hurt Nazis. And Lansky says, well, all due respect, well, we can do better than hurt. And Perlman does a very smart thing. He says, no, there must be no killing. Second you start killing these guys, you're going to lose the moral high ground. What you got to do is you got to keep it off the front pages of the newspapers. Make sure it appears on page 7. Just go in there and bust a couple of bones, hit them over the head with a stick if you have to, but don't kill anybody. And pretty soon they're going to think twice about having meetings above ground.
And this was, so Belansky went into action, and who did he recruit?
He recruits the Jewish members of Murder Inc.
Tell him about Murder Inc. Murder Inc. was basically a Jewish hit organization, right?
Yeah, well, there's a combination of Italians and Jewish killers who worked outside the 5-family system. And if the commissioners of the commission, the bosses, voted to whack somebody, Murder Inc. would get the job. And it didn't make any difference if it was the killer's grandmother, had to be done. And that's how they got paid. So what the first thing Lansky does with these guys, because they're good with guns and not necessarily with their fists, is he takes them to Gleason's gym, which is then in the Bronx, and gives them a lesson in team building. Because again, they would go out in pairs to whack a guy, but this was going to be, you're going to have to wade into a crowd and hurt as many people as you can and then get out before the cops show up. So they learned how to throw some combinations. And the next big meeting with the German-American Bund followed a parade on East 86th Street in Manhattan. As at the old Yorkville Casino meaning party house, not necessarily house of gambling. And the Germans are all in there drinking beer and singing "Happy Birthday" to Hitler. And the boys from Murder Inc. show up, and Lansky opens up a cardboard box, and inside are a bunch of brand new American Legion hats. This is a lesson he learned from Albert Anastasia, to throw off investigations. You put the hat on, you go in there, you do some damage, you get out. On your way out, you lose your hat. Sure enough, in 48 hours, the police are going to say, well, we think it was American Legion guys that busted up the meeting.
Were the police in on it at all? And
the police were probably in on it. I have found no incidences where they reacted effectively. They usually showed up just in time to not arrest anybody, call an ambulance, because usually there's a couple of guys down. But the only Jewish guy who got arrested in all of the fights I covered was arrested because he smashed a reporter's camera, not because he hit a Nazi.
And the media didn't pick up on it. First, how many incidents were there of Nazis being beaten up? Let's look at New York. Let's look nationwide.
I would say there were, in Newark alone, there were a dozen. In New York, 2 downstate, 2 upstate. There were a series of small skirmishes in Chicago, 1 big brawl in LA, and a bunch of, the fights in Minneapolis always took the form of almost vandalism and mischief, because they had their meetings in private houses, and these guys were smart enough not to bust into somebody's house and start hitting people because somebody might have pulled a gun. In those cases, the host came out and said, "Please stop your chanting," and they dragged him out and they threw him in a nearby pond, and that was the violence. And they threw rocks and rotten fruit at the house. So I would say, well, would you put that all together? Maybe 20 fights, but it was enough that they no longer announced in public where they were going to meet next. It forced them to be secretive. And even then, in Chicago and in LA, there were spies involved to find out where those meetings were going to be held. And sure enough, the tough guys would show up for those as well.
Michael Benson's our guest, the author of more than 60 books. You can find him on television, ID Investigation, Discovery Channel. But his latest book is called Gangsters versus Nazis: How Jewish Mobsters Battled Nazis in Wartime America. America had a lot of anti-Semitism, not just German anti-Semitism. You had Father Coughlin on the radio. You had other haters that existed too. Did they primarily focus on the German haters, or were they equal opportunity?
Oh no, they were equal opportunity. The Silver Lodge of William Pelly was probably their second favorite target. And it was also the second largest group of fascists in America. It was not nearly as German as the German American Bund. It was more white supremacist as we would think of it today. And it was run by a guy named William Dudley Pelly, who had come out of Hollywood of all places. He wrote movie scenarios when there were silent movies, and claimed that he'd had a near-death experience, had gone to heaven, and God said, "No, no, we're not ready for you yet. You have to go back to Earth and spread the word of my disciple Adolf Hitler." So Pelly, because the German American Bund were known as the brown shirts, he gave his men light blue shirts, called them silver shirts, although they were not silver. And he would have meetings with the marching and paramilitary uniforms and things up in the Minneapolis St. Paul area. And he, out of all of the haters in the book, he sort of lands on his feet. After all is done and Pearl Harbor changes everything, he resurfaces as a guy who's spreading the same kind of paranoia, but now he's blaming flying saucers instead of Nazis, or instead
You're
of
missing a
Jews.
screw.
Sorry.
Now, what I found fascinating that New York was a center where you was the east side of Manhattan in the East 80s. What about Long Island? Wasn't there a community that named the street after Adolf Hitler?
Yeah, Yaphank, Long Island, pretty much went all Nazi during the Great Depression, and that was also the site of one of the youth camps that Fritz Kuhn of the German American Bund set up. And this is the thing that really upset me the most. I had no idea that in 1938 a German parent could send his kid to a camp and think that they're going to play baseball and run and swim, and when the kid gets there, they find that there's also going to be a section where you Sieg Heil and you goose step, and you learn to hate the Jews. And these camps were set up outside major cities across the country. And on weekends there would be a parade, and the kids would march in their uniforms, and the parents would come and drink beer, and then there would be a big speech. Sometimes politicians showed up who seemed oblivious to the fact that this was anti-American. There was always an American flag next to the Nazi flag. There was always a portrait of George Washington next to the portrait of Adolf Hitler. That the un-American was, you had to figure it out to get to that.
You mentioned Fritz Kuhn, the vest pocket Hitler. Tell us more about him.
Well, Fritz was a con man. It's hard to tell which of his claims were true. He did at one point shake hands with Hitler, because he had a big photo of it on his office wall. He claimed to have been at the 1923 beer putsch with Hitler, and that he was Hitler's number one guy in America. He was a strange loner. He would go from post to post by himself, drinking schnapps, and twice woke up with his car off the road, once hanging off a bridge. He loved to fool around with women. He had girlfriends that were angry at him, a wife that was angry at him. And eventually he went down for embezzling from his own organization.
Which is, well, listen, you write that a lot of them were perverts and thieves as well, right? That's
Well, you would figure that what they say, 0.02% of the German Americans were part of these groups. And you got to figure they're probably not the top citizens. The ones who are prone to hate, they're a little bit on the edge of society anyway, I would think.
Now, you write about during World War II, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Charles Luciano had a contract out on Hitler. Tell us about it.
Well, yeah, but like everybody else who had a contract out on Hitler, they couldn't get close enough. Siegel was close to a couple of top Nazi officials in a hotel in Berlin during the pre-war era. He was over there with a patent for an explosive and dating a countess, and he wanted to go down the hall and bop off those top anti-Semites, and she talked him out of it, saying that if he did that, they would just kill her family, and she would prefer that he didn't. And he did. But he did bop a few Nazi heads back in LA when he got home.
Now, you write there's some colorful Jewish mobsters that you write about, including Louis Lepke Buchhalter. A lot of them had middle names that were very funny ones too. But Tell us about him.
Well, Lepke is by far the richest man ever to be, ever to die in Old Sparky, to sizzle in Old Sparky at Sing Sing. He was executed, um, although a multimillionaire, and one of the few times that's ever happened in America, which gives you an idea of that you could have a lot of money in being a Jewish gangster, but your power was really reliant on the underworld system.
How many Jewish mobsters were executed by the government?
Oh, I would think only a handful. I mean, I know that Mendy Weiss went at the same time as Lepke, so that's at least two. But yeah, that wasn't the number one way that these guys died. They had to survive the life on the street before the government got a crack at them.
You read about one mobster who went from his luxurious mansion to prison, but he had, all kinds of. He was basically dined and feted in jail, right?
Well, that's Bugsy Siegel, and L.A. is it's difficult to put people into categories because the government and organized crime and the police force were all as one, and they functioned as a team, and there was no law and order. There was just power, and it's Bugsy Siegel. When he was arrested, they put him in his own private jail cell, which was in an annex building by itself, away from the other prisoners, and he was allowed to have women visit him whenever he wanted. There was the kitchen; he could call out and have food delivered if he wanted, and I'm sure that once he got out, he made everybody who gave him those perks, feel like it was worthwhile.
Right, because that's
Yeah,
it was if he didn't. The only thing was missing was the internet.
that's right. I'm sure that sure he had a radio. It's probably the best they could do back then.
Right, so he sort of got away with it. Who are some of the more colorful mobsters that were involved in this fight against beating up American Nazis?
Well,
Or Germans who loved Nazis and hated Jews?
I well, we got Harry Strauss, aka Pep Strauss, Big Harry and Pittsburgh Phil. I like that nickname, the last nickname, best because he'd never been to Pittsburgh and his name wasn't Phil. Bugsy Goldstein, who was a quipster, I guess you would say. He was the Rodney Dangerfield of the group. He would say, "I know you need me," like a hole in the head, and then he'd shoot the guy in the head. He and Meyer Lansky came closest to breaking the no-kill rule at the Yorkville Casino when they dropped the guy out a second-story window. And if he'd landed on his head, that would have been that. There would have been the front page of the Daily News would have been the guy with the cracked head on the sidewalk. But instead, he landed feet down and only broke a leg.
Now, what about Davy the Jew Berman?
Well, Davy the Jew Berman was the head. Well, first of all, not a nickname you hear that much anymore. Like Whitey. There was the Whitey Ford. Right? But Davy the Jew Berman ran the Twin Cities in Minneapolis, and he was the head of gambling and all of the rackets. And he was one of the last people that Judge Perlman called, and these guys, like I said earlier, they were the least violent. They sort of were vandals and mischief guys, and they pelted houses with rocks and rotten vegetables, and were content to drag people into ponds and soak their tuxedos rather than hurt them in any physical way.
Now, did Judge Perlman call individuals aside from Mayor Lansky? Did he actually call others?
Well, yeah, we know this because Mickey Cohen almost rats him out. Yeah, I got a call from a judge, and then he doesn't give the name. So I go, well, it's Perlman. He's calling, and Cohen's from New York City. They know each other, so it kind of makes sense. All of the gangsters who led their individual fighting teams in the various cities were bootleggers.
And I find interesting that Judd Teller, a journalist who supplied Murder Inc. with the list of Nazi scumbags, became an advisor to National Jewish groups and an assistant professor at Yeshiva University, as well as being the political secretary of the World Zionist Organization.
And the lists, as it turned out, were the most lasting benefit of all of this. I mean, everybody's wounds healed, nobody died, but the lists that they gathered of who was a Hitler sympathizer, so that the gangsters would know who to hit, those were used later on to keep these guys from working where there might be sabotage, to keep them off the docks, to keep them out of shipbuilding facilities.
Our guest is Michael Benson. He's written over 60 books. His latest one is fascinating, called Gangsters versus Nazis: How Jewish Mobsters Battled Nazis in Wartime America. One of the people who was pro-Nazi, who was a big and popular radio broadcaster, was Father Charles Coughlin. And he used the airways to spread anti-Semitism, pro-Nazi propaganda. Was there any action that the Jewish mobsters tried to take against him and his broadcasts?
You don't know. Father Coughlin had more problems from the Ku Klux Klan because he was Catholic than he did from the Jewish mobsters. I'm not sure that they saw him as something that could be attacked, because he was in the air, he was broadcasting, and he had a silky kind of a radio voice, which he cloaked all of his hatred in a very loving tone. And it would be in the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost, hate Jews and love Hitler. And every Sunday afternoon on a radio show that was syndicated, it was on in the Midwest mostly, but it was syndicated, went coast to coast. I think in some places, Father Coughlin's broadcast was interrupted for the announcement of Pearl Harbor, which seems, he must have known he was out of business right away at that point.
Was that the final touches after that?
Pearl Harbor changes everything. It's one of the reasons I think that these stories aren't better known, is because everybody's role changes. The Jewish gangsters go back to their day jobs. The younger ones are drafted and fight in Europe. Nat Arno, who fought Nazis in the streets of Newark, was among the forces that landed on D-Day at Normandy, marched all the way to Berlin, and claims that twice during that time he saw POWs being marched in the opposite direction, that he knew and knew him from fights they'd had in Newark, New Jersey. The Germans, a lot of them were drafted as well, and they were sent to the Pacific where they're questioned. And the German leaders who had been hiding behind the First Amendment were suddenly committing sedition, and many of them were fleeing for Mexico.
What surprises me that the United States interned Japanese in camps during World War II. The Germans seem a lot more dangerous. You have 100,000 sympathizers that sympathize with Hitler, hated Jews. So was there no action on a federal level against them?
There was not. And I think largely on racist grounds. To use the phrase that was popular at the time, there were dirty Japs, but we were fighting Hitler. It's you can look at the way that Americans treated German POWs compared to how they treated Japanese POWs. Oh, wait, they didn't take Japanese POWs. They would just kill them. So, the Japanese Americans got the short end of the stick because Asians always got the short end of the stick in America in 1941.
Was there anti-Japanese sentiment like there was anti-Semitic sentiment and those war years after Pearl Harbor? To the same extent that there was that anti-Semitism, the hatred of the Jews?
Well, sure. I would think that and my dad was by a year or two too young to fight in World War II. But I grew up in a house where we were taught not to trust the Japanese because they were sneaky. And if I wanted to talk to somebody who was a German American, I just had to talk to my grandparents. And I was a little worried when I was doing the book that I was going to run into somebody on my mom's side of the family who was one of these Bund guys. But when Fritz Kuhn and the German American Bund got to Rochester, New York, where I grew up. Nobody showed up. And I'd like to think that's because there weren't any haters there. I know that the local German American group said, no, don't team up with these guys because they're haters and that's not who we're about. But also by that time, word was out that if you went to one of these meetings, the chances were good that somebody with brass knuckles might hit you. And sure enough, when the empty auditorium that night with no German Americans arriving, there were some shady looking characters in the lobby flipping silver dollars. And so I think the ones who stayed home were smart and nice, or both.
Where was that? Now, Michael, I know you're Catholic. You mentioned you're from upstate New York. Had you had access to so many of the Jewish mobsters, or at least their descendants?
I had the great good luck of going to Hofstra University during the 1970s, which predominantly Jewish school. And I'm absolutely the right age to have friends who are grandsons and granddaughters of the people who appear in my book. And I learned, and a lot of the Brooklyn hoods in particular had kids who moved to Long Island, specifically the Oceanside area of Long Island, where I have a lot of friends. So I just, when I announced that this is what I was going to be writing about, I ended up finding a lot of sources I didn't have to look for at all. They were there all along. And after the manuscript the rough draft was done, they made sure I didn't make any Goyish mistakes.
Give us an example. What did they correct?
Oh, no.
But listen, it's a fascinating book, and there's so much to talk about that. Let's look at Herb Brin. He was a Chicago reporter who infiltrated the German American Bund, which was a source of a lot of the anti-Semitism and the neo-Nazis. I
spoke to Herb Brin's sons. They're really proud of him. He was a Jewish journalist, spent his entire life fighting anti-Semites. When he was a teenager, he once got off of a city bus going down Kedzie Avenue in Chicago because there was a loudmouth yelling anti-Semitic things. He dragged this guy off the city bus, beat him up and down the block, left him laying, and then got back on the bus, which had waited for him, to a standing ovation. And then they moved on down the line. He, as they say, could pass for Gentile. I'm under orders not to say he's blonde. Although he had sandy hair. Okay, so he was sandy hair. He could pass for a Gentile. So they had him go to German American Bund meetings saying he was German American. And when by this time the meetings had gone underground, were secret, and he would find out where and when, and he'd go back to Davy Miller's boxing gym on Kedzie Avenue, tell the boys in there where and when, and then they'd show up and bust the place up.
Now, you mentioned boxing. Boxing at one point was a Jewish sport, and there were some boxers also that were recruited to beat up some of these Nazis.
Oh yeah, the Nazis in some cases were the supervisors, and it's hard to draw a line between the boxers and the hoods to begin with, because many boxers moonlighted as bouncers working for organized crime or muscle or collectors, whatever they were. After they retired, they would often move into the organized crime world. And boxing was run by mobsters at that point. So very easy for gangsters to recruit boxers to do their bidding. And Jewish boxers in particular felt that it was their responsibility as Jewish men, and later on after the war as patriots, to fight these guys with all of their ability.
One of the boxers was Jacob Sparky Rubenstein.
Yes. Well, he was a guy who might have had some mental illness problems. His mom, and his best friend was Barney Ross, who was a multi-division champion Jewish boxer. And the thing they had in common is they both had moms who had been institutionalized for mental illness, and they were lifelong friends. Jacob Rubenstein, he became more famous in 1963 with his name shortened to Jack Ruby when he shot alleged assassin Lee Harvey Oswald in the basement of the Dallas Police Department.
Wow. So some of them had an afterlife.
And when he's interviewed later by Earl Warren of the Supreme Court and Gerald Ford, future president from the Warren Commission, he leads with, guys, I want you to know I'm a patriot. Back in the days, I used to bust some bund heads. And it was my first inkling years ago when I was working on Who's Who in the JFK assassination that that there was an organized effort by Jewish mobsters, although they were trying to deny he was a mobster, but not doing a very good job of it. But that they were fighting the fascists during the Depression.
Now, with a few moments left, J. Edgar Hoover, but the FBI didn't really get involved in the situation of trying to find out who's beating up these Nazis. Was he compromised in some way? In your book, you seem to hint, or maybe not so hint, say blatantly that maybe they had some hold, some of these mobsters had some hold over J. Edgar Hoover.
Well, yeah, J. Edgar Hoover never, ever admitted to organized crime being a thing that actually existed. Very, very suspicious. And while there were other parts of the government that were having un-American activities hearings revolving around the far right wing, Hoover kind of stayed off that until after the war, when it switched from being Nazis to being communists. And then he decided he would be anti-communist instead, and never was anti-organized crime.
But didn't they say they had some compromising information about him that sort
Well,
of?
yeah,
I know it's a rumor, but you're right about that.
well, he enjoyed wearing ladies' garments, and
And
not that there's anything wrong with that.
But
I can see why he wouldn't want it on his resume.
Was he blackmailed by some of the?
I would think that he lived a very sweaty existence, looking over his shoulder. But he armed himself with a lot of blackmail material himself. So I think there were many, many standoffs.
Finally, Michael Cohen. Okay, finally, what about Mickey? You write about Mickey Cohen. Mickey Cohen was a colorful character, but he came to a tragic end.
Yeah,
Some of the mobsters you write about also came to a tragic end.
yeah. Well, these guys, they don't have long life expectancies to begin with. Mickey Cohen took a lot of bullets. There were many attempts to bump him off, and they say that, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Well, I think Mickey Cohen is an argument against that, because the things that didn't kill him just chipped him away until he was a mere shadow of himself, and he had to spend the latter part of his life in pain and in prison. The only one who lived to be old was Meyer Lansky, and eventually it was the smoking non-filter cigarettes that got to him. But he was a more behind the scenes guy than Cohen.
But as we close out, the main hero, I guess, will be Judge Perlman for recruiting the Jewish mafia to beat up these Nazis.
Absolutely. Judge Perlman thought outside the box. And without him, I can't see any of these efforts being on the scale or the effectiveness that they existed in. Only in Newark was there really an organization to fight Nazis that pre-existed Judge Perlman's urgings.
But it's unusual for a jurist to take the extrajudicial. I mean, listen, he had a chance, but he also was open to risk of any, because you're dealing with hoodlums who could rat him out.
Oh, but he was true to that. There was a difference between what's legal and what's just, and justice was what he was interested in.
Oh, listen, I'm not sure if that would be able to exist today, but I guess.
Oh, no. None of it could happen today. Someone would pull a gun.
Right.
There's one guy gets shot in my entire book, and it's probably a mob thing, not a Nazi thing.
Right. But so they were able to restrain themselves from not killing the Nazis, just beating them up.
Right. And vice versa. There was never the guy on the stage pulled a gun and started shooting.
But was there ever a case of the Nazis here in America, knowing that they had the Jewish mafia behind it, that they went and tried to stop them or confront them or do anything to take revenge? Is there any instances that you know about?
I know of no such incidents. And I think one of the joys of Gangsters versus Nazis is that it's a series of fights between Jewish men and Nazi men, and the Jews win every single time.
Hey, I love it. Let's be made into a Hollywood movie.
I sure hope so. We're working on it.
Terrific. You got to come back. I may recommend the book. It's called Gangsters versus Nazis, How Jewish Mobsters Battled Nazis in Wartime America. Our guest is Michael Benson. He's written more than 60 books. And what's your 61st book going to be?
It's going to be The Cigar, and it's a biography of Carmine Galante, who probably most famous for dying behind Joe and Mary's restaurant in Bushwick with the cigar still in his mouth. But he also was a political assassin in his younger days. Pretty fascinating story.
Well, thank you for joining. Look forward. We're going to have you back.
Thank you, Zev. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening.
For continuous Jewish programs, talklinenetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the talklinenetwork.com.